shelf tour time. I saw one of these the other day posted by Matt Defoe at Science Fiction Reads, my old chum in Canada. Hey Matt, hope you're well. People have asked me to do them. As I'm always saying, the problem is that most of my books are in the hideout. The hideout is very small and full of all sorts of cultural artifacts. So we're just going to do one corner because, quite honestly, to do the lot, it's going to have to be over a series of videos, probably over about the next year or so, because I have to move so much to get at stuff. So I thought what we'd do is have a look in what's laughingly known as the damp corner, which isn't damp, but does need a good paint. So apologies to anybody with delicate sensibilities vis-a-vis home decor. I will get to it at some point. The video, of course, is in despair about this. So I have shown some of this before very early in the history of the channel on a couple of shelfies, but we're going to look basically at this area, which is fundamentally science fiction. I don't think there's any fantasy here. This is all SF and some associational works, and it's all things in sort of Octavo, Crown Quarter format, so it's the smaller books, with a couple of exceptions of these reference books here. So first of all, reference books. I am going to do a full-blown SF and fantasy reference book video at some point, but that will take some doing and it'll take some sort of getting of stuff together. Just to put that comment into more context, I've already said that I've had to move lots of stuff. I've literally had to move over 20 really useful boxes to get into this corner to be able to reach this top shelf, and you know, it's hard work because I've got to put them all back. I had to do it because I've got to find a few books as well, which I don't know where I've put them. I want to do a sword and sorcery video and I need to find my Lagan hardbacks and I can't find them. I know they're here somewhere. So as you'll see here, these two massive tomes are the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction in the second edition on the left, and the Encyclopedia of Fantasy in the first and only edition on the right. Next to them, with a yellow faded spine going way back, that takes me back and makes me very nostalgic. I bought that. That's the first edition of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction in paperback. Now when I say edition of course actually refers to content. Let's just pull that around so you can see it. And I bought this very early 80s. It was published in the late 70s, won the Hugo Award. And these three books are really the foundation of my science fiction reference library. And I have other things which I bought sort of at the same time or prior to these, and I'll show you those again. But fundamentally, you cannot even begin to get a proper context on SF. You can use Wikipedia, you can do what you like. The fact is the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction is the motherlode and where it all begins. Now both editions are very out of date. The third edition is a website because there's no chance it'll ever be a book again at this stage, and you should refer to it, but I would say do pick up preferably the second edition from the early 90s because that's more up to date. Obviously it's very out of date nonetheless, it's nearly 30 years out of date, but the fact is that in the last 30 years in SF a lot less has happened than the 30 years prior, I can tell you that now. So get hold of it because it has the beauty of a book. You can flip through it. Yeah, you can hyperlink on the website, but the difference is you can just pick it up at any time, leaf through it, and that's how you build up really good contextual knowledge of SF. My contextual knowledge, of course, is based not just on the reading of those books, the reading of actual SF as well, of course, for a long time before that, of working in book selling SF, dealing with publishers, authors, talking to readers every single day. And decades of that gives you a sort of perspective that you can't really get quickly, and that quite frankly only a few people will ever get in a lifetime. You know, you've got to do an awful lot of reading and you have to understand the sort of whole business, as it were, side of things to get a real perspective, and that's what I hope to do in the channel. So what are we seeing here? Well, a few interesting things. I'm trying to keep anthologies separate these days to everything else. There's a couple I fitted in here. And what's an anthology? An anthology, of course, is a collection of stories by diverse hands with an overall editor or editors. A collection is a different thing and an omnibus is a different thing. A collection is short stories by one author. An omnibus is a single volume edition of 2 or 3 books by the same author, but an anthology is a collection of stories by diverse hands. This is Aries 1, has lots of my favourite British SF writers in there. Chris Priest, Bob Shaw, Colin Wilson, Robert Holdstock, Gary Kilworth, and it's edited by John Grant, who, as you will see, is one of the editors of the Encyclopedia of Fantasy, which I can't recommend enough. And I'm not really a fantasy fan, but you know, if you've got to be into SF, you've got to understand fantasy, and that's a very important thing. So there'll be more stuff on fantasy on the channel as we go on. I have talked about it a bit, but it's usually I talk about it in relation to SF. So what have we got at the top here? Well, there's a copy of The Saliva Tree by Brian Aldiss, Faber UK First, and Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and that's a fairly recent edition from Library of America. So I'm not going to show you all the covers of these, because of course in these videos, you know, you show everything you've got more or less, and you know, there's no surprises for anybody then. So there's lots of Aldiss first editions in Cape. Nearly everything you'll see here is a first edition, a UK first or a world first, and this might be the time to talk about the use of the term edition. So that's a first edition of Enemies of the System by Aldiss and Jonathan Cape. And some of those are signed, but as I say, they're bagged, so I'm not going to pop them out. I'll show you a load of signatures again. Perhaps we'll do a signature video. And as I said, I talked about editions of the reference books there. And of course, edition refers to content. So the first edition of a book is its original content when it is first printed. The second edition is when the book is revised, reissued, updated. And of course, it's non-fiction terminology. Now, very few novels are revised, so most novels, of course, if they're never revised, they're all basically first editions, because collectors like me, like many others, we're using the wrong term, and we've used the wrong term for years and years and years. What we should say when we talk about collecting is a first printing or first impression, which is effectively the same thing. So when people say, I've got a first edition of this or that novel, what they actually mean is that they have the first printing of that novel, or the first impression of that novel. So the fault really is with us collectors. We're using the wrong term all the time. So we shouldn't say I have a first edition, we should say I have a first printing. What you'll see is a lot of books, if you look on the colophon, the printing history behind the full title page, you will see that they say first edition. Then you look at the number line, and if the number line doesn't have a 1 in it, then it's not a first printing. If it is a 2, it's a second printing, and so on. Doesn't matter what order the numbers are in, but if you're missing the 1 from the number line, and I'll show you this in another video, then what you've got is a later impression. So it doesn't matter if it says first edition, because that refers to content. If you're talking about a collectible, what you want is the first impression with the 1 in the number line. When it gets to books before a certain period, that's far, far more difficult. But with modern first, that's the way to go. Though there are some exceptions. Side-by-side comparison here of The Avatar by Poul Anderson. On the left is the Sidgwick and Jackson hardcover first, UK, and beside it is the book club edition from Science Fiction Book Club, which I had first. And I've kept both because I like both liveries, and there you go. So that sort of shows you how the SF Book Club in the UK saved money by having a pictorial jacket that was non-coloured. Now, behind this chap from AIM, Advanced Idea Mechanics, a recent acquisition, are some Mike Ballard first, and you can see them in Mike Ballard videos. So we'll move swiftly onwards, going more into the corner here, and there you see this Greg Bear, 7 House, and that's Hegira. Hegira is a word I use a lot. I'm very fond of it. I'm trying to bring it back into usage, and Hegira means journey or odyssey, and very, very handsome book, 7 House. They're mostly produced for libraries. Uncommon, in great condition. I've got loads of those, and I'm a big fan of 7 House, actually. They're still going now, but they don't really do SF anymore, which is a shame. And we have some Besta there, and I'll just have a quick look at Extro. And Extro, aka the computer connection, was Besta's return to SF after a long time, when his sort of work as a magazine editor at Holiday when that folded. He sort of left SF because he did really well in magazine publishing, editing and journalism. And this was sort of regarded as a bit of disappointment. It's about 75, I seem to remember. This is a Methuen UK first, and I actually really like it. I think it's a really good book. I think it's underrated. But the one next to it, The Deceivers, is easily his worst book by a long way. Then we've got a little Cedric Silver by Bischoff and Bailey, and some more stuff in the corner there. Some Ray Bradbury and John Brunner, Algis Budrys, Anthony Burgess and William S. Burroughs. As I say, most of these are firsts or first thus. So what's a first thus? Well, a first thus is the first printing, first impression of a book in a particular format. So if you have, say, the first printing of a paperback, that's a first thus. So you've got that now, it's the first thus. So thus is a different later version, but it's the first appearance in that format, the first printing in that format. Now, to illustrate that point, here's a first thus of Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles in Granada, I think it is, yes, Granada. And I bought this a while ago, and interestingly, before this in the UK, in Granada, this was called The Silver Locust, which was the original title. And I've got exactly the same book in the paperback livery with the same cover, but it says The Silver Locust on it. I've also got a later one that says The Martian Chronicles. So this is a first thus of The Martian Chronicles as opposed to The Silver Locusts. Just to show you another Bradbury, I've got a few of these Hart Davis reprints. That's Dandelion Wine, very plain livery. These are from the late 70s, early 80s, but they're really nice. They're very hard to find in sort of tip-top condition. The ones I've got, I think I bought new. I certainly bought that one new, and that's my favourite Bradbury novel, which of course is a mainstream novel. So that Bradbury is there because it's associational, as I say. So associational works go here as well. This is a Millington UK First of Into the Slave Nebula by John Brunner, which is sort of more routine one of his books. And I just want to show it to you because I really love plain jacketing. And there's like no publishing like this anymore. And I'm sure people think it's very uncommercial. But I really like good, solid, plain jacketing. I got that a while ago. And it's effectively new. And it cost me about like 8 or 9 quid or something. Marvellous. In contrast, here's a Methuen late 70s Brunner, The Wrong End of Time. And Methuen did probably about 8 or 10 SF novels around about the same time in hardcover, and they're really nice. I really like them all, and they've all got terribly brown paper because the stock use wasn't acid free and really cheap, but I've got a real fondness for these, and I bought most of them new, of course. This is my copy of A Clockwork Orange. This is like a 7th printing, and I got Burgess to sign this for me when I met him. You know, at first it'd be nice to have, but I bought this new because it was in print then. I'm sure if it's in print at the moment, it probably is, but you can't get it in a nice plain livery like this. And he was absolutely charming, so I got him to sign that for me. Fantastic. And obviously he talked about it millions of times. He's very bored rigid with this. He wrote loads and loads of fiction. I read about 30 books by him, and he was very gracious though, and was interested in talking about it, and it remains one of the very finest science fiction novels ever written. It's a must read. It should be in everybody's top 15 really. Now we're on to the second shelf, and the light is really variable in here because, as I've often said, there's so much light in my house. There's lots of windows, and it's sunny, but it's raining at the same time, so we're going to get a bit of glare, so it's a bit frustrating. And because the books are bagged or covered, you are going to get some glare, so I do apologise, but you are getting to see what I wasn't thinking of doing for ages and ages and ages. So we'll have a look here again. I've talked briefly on the channel early on about William S. Burroughs and how important he is per se, and how important he is to the development of New Wave SF. That's a Cape First of Nova Express. Generally regarded as his purest SF novel. It's part of a trilogy. The trilogy all have the same story. They look at it from different angles. It's non-linear, experimental, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's the sort of stuff I really love personally. So you'll see some more Burroughs there. Angela Carter, who did a video about Angela recently, and here's some of her books in firsts. And I think I showed this in a book haul a while ago. This is an Arthur C. Clarke Best of Volume 2, Sidgwick, early 80s, 56 to 72. And I bought that on Abe, and it was, how much was it? £18, which sounds like a lot, But there's a seller on Abe has got this, and they want something like 120 quid for it. It's really uncommon, and it's in the States, so it just goes to show you, keep your eyes open, you can get a score. It was from a bookshop in Cardiff, old new stock, as they say. So I was really pleased with that, because these Sidgwick books, there's the logo there, lovely, are really quite uncommon in good nick. They all at the library, so they're all in a complete state. And here's an interesting one. Here's another one of those Methuen books, like the Brunner one. This is The Man Who Japed, in UK hardcover first. It's not the world first, there's one before that. And this is Methuen, late 70s. And it's basically the A format paperback bound in boards, and that's what it is. And it's an early Dick, it's a minor one. But, you know, it's great fun. So there you go. And that will, these days, gosh, that'll set you back about 90 quid. So there you go. But of course, I didn't pay that much for it. I've had it for quite a long time. So there you go. So what else have we got? We've got some other things. I think I showed this Clark collection. I got this at Bear Island Books in Cardiff for about 5 quid. Rather nice. D.G. Compton is somebody I'm really passionate about, and I wish I had more of his books in hardcover. I've read pretty much everything. I think I've read everything under his name. The Palace, that's a really scarce collectible book. Had that for many, many years. Probably fetch, let me see, 60 to 80 quid these days, maybe more. And that's Hodder and Stoughton as well. Then we see some Gollancz Yellow Jackets, more Compton, Michael Coney, who I'm really fond of. I really like Michael Coney, and if you've not read him, he's a British writer, sort of quite sentimental. He lived abroad a lot. He lived in Canada, but I think he ran a hotel. He was quite big in Australia. This is the Gollancz Yellow Jacket UK first impression of Brontemeg. There's a series, the Amorph series, which includes Mirror Image, his first novel, Charisma, The Jaws That Bite, The Claws That Catch, aka The Girl with the Symphony in Her Fingers, and this one. And this won the BSFA award, I think, in '76. And I love his stuff. It's very gentle and pastoral. He always has these sort of very adolescent, sentimental romances in his books, but I absolutely love them because they have such flavour, which is just great. So just up here, I've got several copies of this book, and this is a reprint from a few years ago. This is Anna Kavan's Ice. This is the Pete Rowan reprint with the die cut in the cover, which is why it's bagged. One of the great catastrophe novels. And this is a book which used to be really, really culty. 1966, then she died. She was an English garden designer and heroin addict. I'm going to do a video about her one day with my friend Graham, because he's a big aficionado as well, and he's got loads of her stuff. I've read quite a few, but he's got an amazing collection of them. And it's a novel about the world is being covered in ice. The ice is coming from nowhere, so it's rather Ballardian, and the narrator's in search of this girl, and it's just amazing. And the characters, their individual characters, their psyches merge and separate, so it's really sort of a study of schizophrenia, because she was in and out the rubber room a lot, you know, it's one of those things. So she had mental health issues, she was a heroin addict, as I say. So yeah, so it's an interesting glimpse into a very troubled mind, but a fantastic writer. Kafka's Sister, Aldous called her. And there's the Penguin Clothbound Little series. There's a new series of Penguin Clothbounds coming out. First lot just come out. There's another lot coming out before Christmas. And Ice is coming out in one of those in a really small little clothbound hardcover. Richard Cowper, somebody I've been revisiting recently, and again, British writer, beloved of sort of people like Christopher Priest, Aldous, you know, we all sort of more new wave guys, we loved him. I do find that he's quite weak compared to a lot of other writers of this generation. I don't think his work is as strong. Probably his best and most famous book is The Twilight of Briareus, which is a Pan Lozenge in paperback, and that's a fantastic book. If you just read one Cowper, Cooper is the real pronunciation. We call him Cowper so we know for the spelling, because the spelling is important if you're looking him up, and that is really, really fantastic. Everybody should have this in their library, despite the fact that I don't think he's as strong as people like D.G. Compton, J.G. Ballard, Keith Roberts. When it comes to English literary SF, I mean, that is absolutely fantastic book, really, really good. Again, set in a ice-covered future Britain. So here's a real rarity. Now, you know, this isn't one that I would sort of put away in a locker, but, you know, this is a really scarce book, and this is published by Robert Hale and is Samuel R. Delany, The Ballad of Beta 2 and Empire Star 2 novellas. And I bought this in the Book Barn, which is possibly these days the sort of worst second-hand bookshop in the world, or one of them. And if you watch the video I made with Jules. It's on Jules' channel actually, the 2 videos made of going to Hay and Why. He insisted on the book barn. I filmed a video there once and I was so angry with how bad it was that I just couldn't put it up because I just did nothing but disparage them, and it just didn't feel right, didn't feel very nice. But you know, they are deserving of criticism. It has got a leaning and faded spine, but this is a book which in, you know, very fine to mint condition will cost you about £300 to £400 if you can find one. And I paid £3 for that, and that was about 15 years ago, I think. Great stuff. Love Delaney. And this is a UK first of Driftglass, his short stories, which is now one of those little penguins, those little sort of penguin SFA formats with the purple spines. And this has, you know, some of the best short stories I've ever read, and absolutely fantastic, including the stunning I and Gomorrah, which for me is one of the most important stories ever written. Fantastic stuff. And this is Delaney when he was at his peak. It really, really is. I would say his short fiction is probably better than his novels, maybe. PKD, lots of Seven House there. The Seven House ones are UK first mostly, and Lies Inc. And that's a reissue of Do Androids Dream from when Gollancz had their 50th anniversary as an SF publisher, which dates back to, let me think, 2012. They did this poll, like a top 10, and I think there were only 2 fantasy novels in it. Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, and is it Faust stroke Eric by Terry Pratchett. The rest was all SF, as it should be, and Androids was in there. So they reissued this, which is nice, because, you know, to get a first, whether UK or US, of Androids is really difficult. Our friends from Frolics 8. I'll just show you this. There is a Seven House Dick video early in the history of the channel, but I'm going to refilm a Seven House special. There you go. And that had the same cover in Grafton, Granada in the 80s. And there's PKD there, and that's a great one. Galactic Pot Healer, first edition. Maze of Death, first edition. Radio Free Albemuth, which is what you should read instead of Valis, in my opinion. And then we move on to Tom Dish, and you know, what can you say? Tom Dish, brilliant writer, really fantastic stuff. And this is a signed copy of Getting Into Death, which is one of his short story collections. Hart Davis, late 60s, early 70s. Isn't that lovely? Nice and simple, but absolutely beautiful, a real period feel. And I did a video a while ago, New Wave Science Fiction School, Bristol, and that's what I got my copies of 334 and Camp Concentration, probably his best novel. Certainly one of my favourites from Beware the Leopard books. I didn't go to Beware the Leopard the other day when I was in Bristol because they only take cash, and I had no cash on me. I hadn't prepared, and there's not an ATM within miles. So I thought, gosh, I really can't sort of be bothered, quite honestly. But I will go back there soon. This is fairly recent acquisition, Black Alice by Tom Dish and John Sladek, in W.H. Allen, whose paperback imprint was Star. And yeah, that's great. I have read that, but not for a long time. I acquired that recently. It's not in tip-top condition. There's a bit of chipping on the spine and the top of the jacket there, but you know, it's an uncommon one, so you've got to take where you can get, really. So just to show you Gollancz Fantasy, there we go. It was Gollancz Fantasy and Macabre before that. This is on Wings of Song, first edition. Very, very beautiful. So they did quite a few in that series, and they've got this sort of Gorgon type head on them, really good. This is an uncommon dish, actually, these days. The Man Who Had No Idea. And routinely, most of these Tom Dish books will cost you, in very fine condition, you're really looking at sort of, let me see, 50 quid up. You know, some of them are a lot more than that. And Dish, just, you know, the mordant black wit, the sophistication. You know, it's an interesting thing when you go back to the late 60s, and if you look at the sort of Hugo and Nebula listings, the Nebula listings fundamentally, because Nebula, of course, is Science Fiction Writers America, which you have to join, and you see no award in various categories, and you look at what was nominated, and then you realise that the old guard had got together. They didn't like the new wave guys. They were young upstarts, they were hippies, they were, you know, dope smoking rock and rollers, and they didn't like their experimentalism, their modernism, the way they were trying to move SF and mesh it with the sort of techniques of mimesis and realism and contemporary fiction, which it really badly needed at that point, because it was getting very, very tired. And basically, you know, they would vote for no award rather than see somebody like Dish or, you know, and some of these guys get awards. They were okay with people like Harlan Ellison and probably with sort of other people in that sort of ilk, but Delaney had no problem winning awards because he was black, and you thought, you know, so there wasn't sort of racism. Maybe there was some homophobia in the case of Dish, because Dish was gay, and you know, great writer and massively neglected. The genocides and camp concentration particularly belong in every serious SF collection. Then we move into a Welsh SF writer, Christopher Evans. That's his first novel, Capella's Golden Eyes, in Faber, from the days when Faber did SF, and there's haven't read that for years. There's The Insider, which is good, and Seven House Fetish. Let's look again. Philip Jose Farmer, Lord of the Trees, which is the first of 2 sequels to A Feast Unknown, which is easily his best novel. This is basically just a great Tarzan adventure, but A Feast Unknown is something else. Isn't that lovely? They don't make them like that anymore. That's what's wrong with publishing. They don't make them like that anymore. Nice and plain. Look at that. Beautiful. Some David Gerald, Man Who Folded Himself, which is a great fun time travel story. There's a few Gibson firsts in the corner there, surprise, surprise. And Robert Holstock's Eye Among the Blind, which is great stuff. That's a first as well. Faber again, beautiful. Shelf number 3. I hope you're enjoying this. It's a lot more ramshackle than I'd like, but it is what it is. So there's more Holstock there. Firsts of Earthwind, Where Times Winds Blow, In the Valley of the Statues, beautiful short story collection. Out of that includes the original version of Mythago Wood, which he later expanded to a novel. So these are also late 70s, early 80s, beautiful stuff. He was a nice guy, met him a few times. Sadly died very young of pneumonia, and it's kind of ironic because, of course, he was he studied tropical medicine and stuff, and immunology, bacteriology, that sort of stuff. So it's a real shame. So he's only in his early 60s, and he was a great guy, and talked to him on the phone, met him a couple of times, and yeah, real sort of shame. Lovely guy, and he deserves to be more widely read. This is a first edition of Mythago Wood, which it says a fantasy. Some people say it's SF. I've read it a few times, but I want to read it again and think of it as an SF novel. Really good stuff. Lots of Jungian archetypes in there. My sort of stuff, very dense and spooky, hauntology, folk horror, all that sort of stuff. Really great. One of the most important fantasy, or maybe science fantasy novels ever published. Really great stuff. So another Sidgwick Silver, Zeno D.F. Jones. I acquired that a while ago when I had a bit of a Sidgwick Silver thing, and I've not read many of them yet. They're fairly minor works mostly, but I was thinking about this the other day, and I was looking at it and reading the plot, and there's something in it which, yeah, it's sort of looking at the back, it sort of reminds you of Alien, or as one element of the Michael Shea story, The Autopsy. So I wonder where, like, The Autopsy I think is the one I was thinking of, but it certainly made me think of something else which was an antecedent to it rather than a precedent. No, Arkham House. Now Arkham House of course exists to preserve the legacy of H.P. Lovecraft in hardcover. But in the sort of 80s and sort of 90s, Arkham did lots of really great SF in hardcover. Now I'm trying to show you this without getting all the sort of flash off the bag. This is Meeting in Infinity by John Kessel. There's a story in here called The Pure Product, and there is a collection called The Pure Product, which is a paperback, which is very hard to find in the UK. And I really urge you to get it. The Pure Product is one of the best SF short stories I've ever read. I'm not going to tell you much about it, but my feeling is that it inspired the film Natural Born Killers. So read it. It really will sort of put a hook in you. John Kessel's really good anyway, sort of professor of literature. His stuff started to appear in sort of book format sort of late 80s, and The Pure Product is really hard, cold, merciless. It's one of the great SF stories. I can't really say enough good about it. It has the sort of uncompromising, memorable quality of things like It's a Good Life by Jerome Bixby, Country of the Kind by Damon Knight, of Woman Born, which is that C.L. Moore, isn't it? Also Vintage Season by C.L. Moore, which he probably wrote with Henry Kuttner. And yeah, great stuff. So The Pure Product, watch out for it. It's really something. More good, solid British literary SF here of the late 70s, early 80s with Gary Kilworth. And Gary, very talented writer. He can write anything. You know, he's one of those people who's never had a bestseller. He began as an SF writer. He had a military career before that as a signalman, travelled the world. And you get his sort of travel sort of thing comes through in his books. I mean, his first novel, In Solitary, which is this one here, is set in the Pacific on an island. It's an alien invasion story, and these bird-like aliens have come to Earth, they've conquered it, and men are kept separate from women to try and sort of quell their sort of wayward nature and to stop them rising up and sort of battling the conquerors. And I really like that. You really get the feel of his travel and his travel writing sort of feel in these books, and they're great, and I really like that one. And this is another favourite, The Night of Kadar, which is kind of a generation starship come planet seeding thing, and it's great. The characters are all Muslims, so it's Islamic, and it's really fantastic book, and it puts a whole new spin on things. So, you know, I'm not being politically correct about this, but this is really a book to read, because you really see a whole different take on this to the sort of Eurocentric one, and it's a marvellous book. I loved it. And there's some others by Gary, and a couple of Gollancz Yellow Jackets, Damon Knight, Man in the Tree, Dad's Nuke by Mark Laidlaw, which I think I mentioned, Mark, in if you watch my, is it up now, is it coming up? I've done a series of videos which are my holiday when I went on a book hunt, nearly, I think not every day, but 4 days out of about 9 of the days. And I talked about Mark because I picked up one of his books with my friend Graham, Small Citric Silvers. Here's a common thing. Here's a book without a jacket. I don't often buy a book without a jacket. And this is The Hole in the Zero by M.K. Joseph. What a title. Isn't that fantastic? Strange book. Well worth a read. I'm very passionate about Barry N. Malzberg. I think Barry's a genius. His books are of a kind. This was his last but one. Well, I say last one, I think he's in a couple of short story collections since then. This was kind of the last one in his main thrust of work, which lasted from the late 60s to the early 80s. This is Arkham House, In the Stone House. And I do feel his sort of focus was drifting a bit here, and he was getting a little bit too difficult to sort of re-pull it together. But, you know, Barry, he's the man. You know, he's miserable, he's grim, he's dark, you know, he's neurotic. But wow, I love his stuff. It's so muscular and powerful. Andy Weir's The Martian. It's a Robisonade. What's a Robisonade, and why am I showing you a book called Shipwreck by Charles Logan? Well, a Robinsonade is the sort of story that derives from Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, one of the great early novels. Defoe was one of the sort of first people to sort of turn non-fiction into fiction and what have you, because of course that was based on a true thing. And, you know, it's a great book, Robinson Crusoe. And it's one of those things that people have seen adaptations and often haven't read the book. So you should read it because it's fantastic, because there's more to it than you think. And this is Shipwreck by Charles Logan, which, as you see, was the Gollancz Sunday Times Joint SF Award winner. And that's about 1975. And obviously then these companies, Gollancz and Sunday Times, used to run a science fiction writing prize. And this was Logan's only published work, I believe. I don't think there's any stories. There's certainly no other novels. And this was going to turn up in a masterwork at one point. And, you know, if you're The Martian, Andy Weir was self-published. And, you know, basically, if I could have sold 10% of the number of copies of Shipwreck, then I would have The Martian, I'd be a happy man. I can't, of course, it hasn't been in print for decades. You can still find it in paperback without too much difficulty. And it's about a guy whose ship crashes on another planet and he has to survive. But the ending, well, let's just say the ending is of a whole different character. I mentioned Dish earlier on, showed you some Tom Dish. If you like the genocides, you'd love this. And it's really well written. You know, it's not a sunny book, but boy, it really does push the conceptual breakthrough at the end, and it's a real shocker. And, you know, it's the only other thing which is similar is Joanna Russ's And We Who Are About To. But I'm not so keen on Joanna's writing. It's very spiky and what have you, which is great. It's, you know, it's great stuff, but it's a sort of similar thing to this. And, you know, he's on his own, and, you know, The Martian pretty much comes from this. You know, maybe Andy Weir never read it. He probably didn't. And it's a very different sort of book, and the same basic subject, but great stuff. Ken MacLeod's Corporation War series, which I love. Barry Malzberg again. I'm just going to flash you this. I don't have a lot of Barry's work in hardcover. I've got tons of paperbacks. This is Guernica Night in New English Library hardcover. This is one of my favourites, actually. And I think, yeah, this is the one I put in 100 must-read science fiction novels. And basically this is set in a future world where there's instantaneous matter transportation. Nobody has to work. Young people are very bored, and they're all very neurotic and tense. And like all of Barry's sort of narrators, you know, these narrators are pretty much all the same. They're all very sort of disturbed men who are really struggling, and they're always having sex, but it's always grim and they never enjoy it. You know, he really is the master of grim, joyless sex. You know, it's fantastic stuff. And a cult appears amongst these young people of the final trip, which means that, you know, there's no thrills left in the world. So the only thrill is to commit suicide. So, you know, quite a dangerous thing. So not a book which we want to become a cult amongst young people with sort of, you know, mental health issues, but absolutely fantastic. And I loved it. I think it's brilliant. Jack McDevitt, Talent for War, UK first from Kinnell, great little publisher. And I know that, is it Matt Defoe is a big fan of Jack McDevitt, and my friend Graham's a huge fan. So there you go. That's his second novel, I think, after the Hercules text. A few more things. And yeah, I'm not a massive fan of Larry Niven. I find him quite clunky as a writer, but I do like these MacDonald hardcovers from the early 80s. This is before Orbit got going properly as the MacDonald Futura SF imprint, and this is The Moat in God's Eye, which was a huge bestseller. I used to stack this so high in the bookshop I worked in the 80s, the bookshops I worked in the 80s. I would always have a stack of it because it sold and sold and sold. And look at that, absolutely beautiful. And you know, you see these around. I try and pick up every one I can find except the ones by Barry B. Longyear. Probably the scarcest one, Songmaster by Orson Scott Card, is hard to get. Road Marks by Roger Zelazny, which is being reissued next year as a Gollancz masterwork. But I've got quite a few of these and they're absolutely lovely. I really like them, and great stuff. So I've picked these up over the last few years for reasonable sums, generally speaking. There's Dream Park. Sorry, you got a terrible glare here. I'm going to try and reposition stuff. No, let's move around here. Bear with me a second. That's slightly better. Niven and Barnes. Stephen Barnes, of course, is a black SF writer. Black SF writer you never hear anything about. He has done singletons. They're quite uncommon. I don't think many of them are published in the UK. But it just goes to show that these supposed right-wing figures, you know, Niven, Pournelle, whatever, they collaborated with him, so they obviously weren't racist or anything, you know. I mean, I don't think much of them as writers, and I don't always agree with their political opinions, but yeah, you know, so there you go. And really, really nice that, isn't it? And of course, there's sequels and what have you. Now, I am, of course, a sucker for a good title, and Oath of Fealty has always grabbed me. Good hard SF title, Niven and Pournelle there. What else do we have? Lucius Shepard's Jaguar Hunter in Arkham House, and Andre Norton, Alan Norse, Edgar Pangborn. We'll have a look at that when I do a post-apocalyptic. Doris Pasertia, who I really like. I mean, you know, Doris is great. She died recently. You know, she was sort of like 92. She's so strange. And this is a sort of mint first Dobson. You can see, find these around. They're usually in a dreadful state. Again, they mostly went to libraries. I haven't read that yet, and she's so weird, but I do like her. Fantastic stuff. She's somebody to watch out for. A lot of them are in Door, of course, in the USA. Most of them are never published in the UK, which is a shame, but there you go. What's this mug? My mum bought me this. This was this dates back, it's broken sadly, to when I was a bookshop manager. I've been a bookshop manager for years now. I did it for 16 years, 24 years in managed positions altogether. She bought me this marvellous manager mug, and funny enough, it broke after I stopped being a manager, so there's something in that, I guess. My staff never listened to, my staff say I never listened to them, or something like that. There you go. Not true, of course. Now, this is a horror novel, so it shouldn't be here. It should be somewhere else in my fantasy and horror novels, but this is Dan Simmons' Song of Kali. Headline UK First Edition, winner of the World Fantasy Award. It's not the world first. It's the same size as an A format paperback. It's basically the A format paperback bound up in boards, but absolutely fantastic. And the number of times in work I have said to people who like Stephen King, have you read Dan Simmons? And they've never heard of him. And of course, Simmons and King, they owe, you know, almost everything they do to Richard Matheson. That's not entirely true. They read people like Richard Stark, lots of other writers, they're influenced by other writers, but Richard Matheson really was the template for those sort of writers. And I think Simmons is a superior writer to King, personally, but he has overproduced. I've read loads of his stuff, and this remains one of my favourite novels by him. And this is quite uncommon now, and I've had this like since it came out, pretty much, you know. So and it's still in print. It's in Gollancz. Pick it up. It's a great horror novel. There's only one page in which something supernatural could be said to happen, but boy does it work. Priest, Tom Reamy, great stuff. And then we get into the Keith Roberts. I'm planning to do a Keith Roberts video. I want to go outside and do it. I haven't got it yet. People have been clamoring for it because Keith doesn't get much attention. That's a Hutchinson First of Machines and Men, just to show you one of his beautiful short story collections. And there's some more Keith in the corner, but as I say, we're going to cover those when I do a Keith Roberts video, a full-blown one. Who's this? It's PKD. This is a picture of PKD, a portrait. My friend Colin bought me for my 50th birthday, which is now nearly 10 years ago. Shocking. The fourth shelf, yeah, that's a signed Jim Burns print there. Just with my finger. There we go. And I'm hoping to meet up with Jim at some point and do an interview because he doesn't live far from here. I just haven't asked him yet. I'm sure he'll say yes when he's well. He's got time. He's got COVID at the moment, so you know, hopefully he'll get well soon. He's a great guy. I've met him a couple of times at cons and what have you. So yeah, down onto the fourth shelf, and Kim Stanley Robinson. You know, it's Kim. You know, he's a good guy, Kim. You know, he's a humanist. His heart's in the right place. I've always found his work very stiff and dull, and I've never really got the big ones. I cannot get interested, but the early ones I've got a fondness for. This is MacDonald. That's Icehenge, which I think is that his first novel. It's certainly one of the very early ones, and you know, it's great stuff. You know, and they are good. But they're very traditional, and he was a humanist amongst the cyberpunks, and you know, I think his work sort of, did it suffer? You know, I've always remember selling plenty of books where he ticked over well. And this is one of the great post-apocalyptic novels of those days, The Wild Shore. Beautiful MacDonald hardcover. It had that cover in paperback, lovely. Again, a real nostalgia fest for me. So, never met him. He was going to come to an event, or rather he was going to drop in and do some signing at a bookshop I work in at the moment a few years ago. And he was late. He was going to do an event somewhere else. And I had my sort of my sort of Philip K. Dick book that he wrote, which was his dissertation, The Novels of Philip K. Dick, which is my favourite book by him. But I had a long day at work. I wanted to get home, and I thought, can I really be bothered to hang on? And I didn't. I should have really. But, you know, this is how blasé you get when you work in it all your life. Bob Shaw there. Lots of nice Shaw firsts and Golags. I do love Bob. You know, great guy. And, you know, some of these now, gosh, most of them I bought new, but wow, you know, some of them you're looking at 100, 250 quid, you know, and they're great. You know, they're out there, but they're hard to find. Here's an interesting example of a routine sort of thing that Robert Hale did, Cloning by David Shear. I just love the simplicity of that title. I bought that for a couple of quid on Abe a few years ago. I've not read it yet. Apparently it's quite good, and obviously it's about cloning, but we'll see, I guess. So that goes in there. Just what have we got up here? Let's a little tickle here. Robert Silverberg, Invaders from Earth, one of the great early Silverbergs. This is a Sidgwick. It's got a bit of a leaning spine, which I'm not happy about, but this is a really uncommon book in this condition. Do love Silverberg. And look at that. Great. I just love these old publishers, the simple liveries, very sexy 70s SF writing there, and good solid names that they published. And there we go. So Sidgwick, you ever seen any Sidgwick and Goodnick? So I picked them up because they're generally in a real state, and you know, it's taken me a long time to find the ones I have in really good nick. And I'm going to pull out, this is one of my favourite Sidgwick books that I owned, and this is the best of Robert Silverberg, as you can see. And this is a mint unread, very fine. And I probably read most of the stories in it. I'm actually going to crack it at some point, but I'm not going to crack it. I don't crack books. I keep them in superb, very fine condition. And I bought this from Mike at Fine Edition, who hasn't been traded for nearly a year now. I really hope something hasn't happened to him, because he has had ill health. And I'm sure he hasn't passed on, because his books are still listed on Abe, and I do want to buy some. So Mike, if you're watching and listening, I really hope you get well, mate. You know, not just because I want to buy stuff from you, but because, you know, you've been part of the scene for such a long time. So look at that, isn't that lovely? And this is sort of typical of the quality you get from Mike. And Mike's given me books in the past. He's such a nice guy. He really is cool. Bit of Sheckley, the Alchemical Marriage of Alistair Crompton. This is a later Sheckley, and I know my friend the good doctor Timothy Coombs, former manager of Forbidden Planet Bristol, he gave Tom Toner, the SF writer, a copy of this recently read, and Tom apparently really liked it, and I forgot to ask Tom about it when I saw him. So maybe when I do a Sheckley video, I'll get Tom to wax lyrical. Charles Sheffield, I think that's his first book. I know Matt Defoe's keen on that. There's a Simac up there in Sidgwick Silver, and there's another little, you know, another book with The Ian Watson, that's another late SF Book Club book. They've got these pictures on, they're really nice, and there are still copies of these out there in good nick, so they're well worth picking up. Some of the ones which I don't have them because I have the original firsts rather than book clubs. Lucius Shepherd, great stuff. MP Shield, more, and then some Silverberg in hardcover. Simak, that's a Simak which Mike at Fine Edition gave me. Some Sladek. I've been trying to complete my Sladek collection. I'll just show you this rather psychedelic cover for the late 60s, early 70s novel The Muller-Fokker Effect, which is about a chap who gets his consciousness gets fed into a computer. So it's sort of pre-cyberpunk really, and quite important that way. Sladek, completely bonkers. Sadly again no longer with us. Now, I'm not much for space opera, as I've said, because to me it's the most traditional form, it's the revisionist form, it's the old school, old-fashioned thing. But now and again, if I had to name one space opera series as being my favourite, I would say it's the Hooded Swan series, 6 volumes, 1970s, Door in the USA, Pan Lozenge in the UK, the Star Pilot Granger, and that's Rhapsody in Black, which is, I think, is that the first one? I think it's the first one. I haven't read them for a while, but J.M. Dent, they did, I think, 3 or 4 of these. I don't think they were hardcovers of the later ones. I think they just went straight into Pan originals and Door originals, and they're great. And there's another one. They're out there again, hard to find in good nick, so I really sort of need to get the other 2 really at some point. Bruce Sterling, Pirate Utopia from Tachyon. Tachyon do some lovely stuff. And of course, Bruce lives in Italy these days. He lives in Turin. He lives in America as well still. He travels around a lot. I think he lives in Bucharest. I think it's Bucharest in Romania. Is that Romania? Is that right? I think it is. Turin in Italy and Austin in Texas, which of course is his sort of hometown really. Lee Kennedy, I think, comes from Austin. I think it was Tom Reamy Texan, George R. R. Martin, Lisa Tuttle. They're good kids, those Texans, as Harlan Ellison said. Hard SF, post-human SF, new radical stuff. Well, I mean, one of the best of those sort of things that I've read, certainly. This is somebody who I was very sceptical of early in his career. And I think Chris Priest once described him as an excitable puppy. And my friend Simon Beeson, I hope you're watching, Simon, hope you're okay, who's a computer scientist and has a brain the size of a planet. Heck of a nice guy. I've not seen him for years. We had many SF adventures together in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And I hadn't seen him for ages. We must get together, Simon. And he was always an apologist for Charlie. And I have to say, this book, Accelerando, Alien Lobsters, Post-Human Future, S&M, it's absolutely brilliant, because what's great about it is that it has all the benefits of the traditional Victorian Edwardian saga novel, the sort of thing that Forsyth would have written. And it's got all great, mind-blowing SF ideas, and it really is fantastic. I think theoretically it's the 3rd in a thematic series. I haven't read the others. I've got some of the stuff by him which I haven't read, and I've read early stuff in magazines like Interzone and what have you. But this, I read this probably about, I think it came out around the turn of the century. I read it about 12 years ago, and it blew me away, and I think it's a fantastic book. And I acquired this first a while ago, very reasonably. Great stuff. Accelerando, for me, one of the best pure SF novels of the 21st century. Then we have some Strugatsky first, which I think I showed in my Strugatsky video, which I reviewed Hard to Be a God. Of course, Moyd has reviewed Hard to Be a God recently. I also talked about Strugatsky's other books and the Strugatsky films, which are not very well known. And I don't mean the ones you know, I mean the other ones. So do check that out. Peter Tate, Welsh SF writer. Now this shouldn't be here because this is a horror novel. Lisa Tuttle, Gabriel in Seven House. Really great little novel. I've read this twice. And Lisa was married to Christopher Priest in the early 80s. Before that, she was George R. R. Martin's girlfriend. They wrote Windhaven together. You see, I shouldn't be doing this. This is terribly sexist, referring to these women only in relation to men. But I'm putting this into context just to show you where Lisa was in terms of the sort of milieu of SF. But she's a fantastic writer, and you know, she's really good and underappreciated. And I've read a fair amount of her stuff, and I should read more. I've never met her. Always wanted to. That Joan Valjean, and recently some Ian Watson. This is one of my favourite Ian Watsons, actually, Queen Magic, King Magic, which really, again, is a fantasy novel. So, you know, oh, it says a science fiction novel. I don't know, I would say it's more of a fantasy novel, but it's been a long time. But Garlick's Yellow Jacket, look at that. They went half pictorial with that. And yeah, it's a chess novel. Great stuff, really is. So there we go. And what have we got on the top? Well, let's have a look. There are some things under here. You've got Vonnegut there, Cat's Cradle in Golank's laminated boards, which I hated last time I read it. I loved it the first time I read it. I always love Slaughterhouse 5. Gets better with each reading. I would like a Cape original. I've had opportunities to buy a reprint. I've never got around to it. I should buy one when I see one in good nick, even if it is a reprint. This is the 50th anniversary edition, which is really, really nice. In Vintage Classics, which of course is part of Random House, as Cape is these days. So there we go. And what have we got up here? Let's have a little look. Great arm shot there. I'm sure you'll love that. And Lewis Shiner, The Edges of Things. Lewis Shiner wrote what is for me one of the most underrated science fiction novels of the 80s, Frontera. He also wrote a great novel about skate punks called Slam, which is fantastic. And yeah, this is a little short story collection. This is published by, gosh, who's this published by? I'll let you look on that John Wyndham in a minute. Small Beer, is it? I'm not sure who's the publisher of this. I can't actually read the colophon. Getting old, you see, that's the trouble. So there you go. And that's a SF Book Club edition of The Trouble with Lichen by John Wyndham. And, you know, Wyndham, I do wish I had more Wyndham hardcovers. The first, even reprints. I mean, last time I was in Hay, there was a reprint. It was like a 4th printing or something like that, Consider Her Ways, and it was 40 quid. And, oh, you know, come on. I can't afford that. It's ridiculous. Who can? And here we go. One of my favourite novels, Colin Wilson, The Philosopher's Stone. Rick McGrath, the editor of Deep Ends, the Ballad anthology, which I've contributed to occasionally, is a big fan of Colin. He's got a huge collection. I've sold loads of my Wilsons. I had tons. I've read at least 70 books by him. I've sold most of the non-fiction. I've kept the novels because I actually prefer the novels. And this is fantastic. I've got about 4 copies of this in different editions. This is a UK first, and it's published by Arthur Barker, a defunct imprint stroke publisher. They've been defunct for years and years and years. And this is a simply amazing SF novel. Absolutely love it. It's about a young chap who forges an alliance with a rich amateur scientist, and they look into the mysteries of human consciousness. And it's just, anyway, I'm not going to say any more. It's fantastic. You should just read it. It's a great book. And yeah, what have we got here? First editions, UK first editions of Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, Shadow of the Torturer, and there's the others here as well. I'll show you those again when we do a Gene Wolfe thing. There's a Wyndham there. Look at that. Stowaway from Mars, Stowaway to Mars, I should say, which is, this is a 7-house edition from the 80s. Most of them went to libraries. I bought that new, and yeah, it's still sort of minty. A few Sidgwick Silvers in the corner. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, who I love Chelsea. 3 of her books. That's Cautionary Tales in Sidgwick. Quite common, these ones. You can pick them up. The ones in Sidgwick are easy to get. I would say the best one of them is False Dawn, the post-apocalyptic one. And right in the very corner there, we've got a couple of Zelazny's from the Amber trilogy, or the Amber series, I should say. Tusk. We're also going to take a brief look at some of my bound graphic novels as well. And down here, a new bookcase I put in a while ago, which I nabbed off a neighbour. And this is mostly mainstream novels, odds and sods, and basically sort of reference works, things like that as well.